Hello friends, my name is JJ, and as part of our ongoing deep dive into the world of Canadian politics, I thought today we would talk a bit about the position of Canadian Prime Minister. It is a pretty strange office in some ways, and I feel like in recent weeks some of that strangeness has really come into focus. So how exactly does someone become Prime Minister of Canada? On what authority does the Prime Minister run the country? What powers does he have? And are there any limits on those powers? And as we attempt to answer those questions, I think we inevitably get into some deeper questions about democracy in general and what our standards for a good democratic political system should be. So Canada's government is said to follow the parliamentary system, but this is a pretty vague category that is applied to an awful lot of countries and doesn't really tell you much about their government other than it has a parliament involved in some way. And I mean, parliament is just a name for a gathering of politicians who make decisions collectively. Every single country in the world has a parliament of some kind, whether they call it the National Assembly, or the House of Representatives, or the Chamber of Deputies, or the Bundestag, or whatever. In practice, of course, we tend to think of a parliamentary system as describing a political system where the leader of the country is a prime minister chosen by and from the parliament, as contrasted with a so-called presidential system where the head of the country is a president elected by the people. I've never liked those terms for a number of reasons, in part because it implies that a presidential system is somehow defined by the existence of a president, while a parliamentary system is defined by the existence of a parliament, even though those are not parallel things. If the title of the system is supposed to refer to the thing that picks the leader of the government, then the presidential system should really be called the voter system or something. But it's even more confusing than that because, of course, there are a lot of countries that have both a president and a prime minister, and there are countries that have a president who runs the country but isn't directly elected by the voters, most notably the good old USA, whose president is picked by an electoral college. So does that mean America should be more accurately described as an electoral college system? Anyway, these sloppy terms are particularly useless when it comes to describing the Canadian political system, which defies a lot of stereotypical assumptions about parliamentary systems as well. I often encounter Canadians who have a lot of confused beliefs about how the Canadian political system works, and then they get even more confused when weird things happen that seem to contradict those expectations. The rise of Mark Carney to the prime ministership last month is a good example, because his becoming prime minister is the sort of thing that seems to contradict a lot of conventional wisdom about how these parliamentary systems are supposed to work. Mark Carney was sworn in as Prime Minister of Canada on March 14th, 2025. The Parliament of Canada, however, was on recess when this happened, and it has since been dissolved altogether because Canada is currently in the midst of a national election. In other words, Carney was able to become Prime Minister and remains Prime Minister to this day, despite the fact that the Parliament of Canada has not convened once during his entire prime ministership. The Parliament didn't elect him or approve him. It quite literally hasn't done anything at all since December of 2024, when it went on winter break and then had its holiday extended by former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But even if the Parliament had met, Carney wouldn't have even been able to attend, since he is not an elected member of Parliament himself, and never has been. So how is all of this possible, you ask? Well, it's possible mainly because, again, I do not think that parliamentary system is really the best way to describe Canada's system of government. It features a parliament, but it is really more of a prime ministerial system, in the sense that the most powerful institution of the government is the prime ministership, with everything else sort of subordinate to him, including the Parliament. All right, so now let us walk through this one thing at a time. So the elected half of the Canadian Parliament is the House of Commons, which passes laws and things. But more importantly, elections to the House of Commons also function as an indirect public election for Prime Minister. There are several political parties in Canada, and every political party has a designated leader. The leader is usually a current member of the House of Commons. If for no other reason, then it is useful for him to be able to participate in parliamentary debates. These party leaders serve as candidates for Prime Minister, and they campaign for the job during a Canadian parliamentary election.
As Prime Minister, I will run a government that will live within its means.
As Prime Minister, I will always stand on the side of law-abiding citizens.
That's why, as Prime Minister, I will work hard for the people who work hard.
When I'm Prime Minister, I will keep my promises.
On election night, the Canadian news networks keep track of what party is electing the most members to the House across the country. And the head of the party that elects the most members is proclaimed the winner. And he is described as having won either a majority government, if he wins a solid majority of the seats, or a minority government, if he wins the most, but not a majority. Making sense so far? Well, hold on to your hats because the next part is very important. Following an election, the head of the party that won the most seats becomes known as the Prime Minister Designate, and he meets with the Governor General a few days after the election, and they agree on a date for his inauguration ceremony. The Governor General is the person who represents the symbolic authority of the British monarchy in Canada, and is responsible for organizing the transition of power from one prime minister to another. This evokes the ancient idea of the prime minister symbolically deriving his power from the majesty of the crown. The prime minister designate is then formally sworn in about 2 weeks after the election. Here is a little chart I made showing the gaps between elections and inaugurations for all of the Canadian prime ministers elected since World War II. Okay, so who hasn't done anything yet? That's right, the Parliament. And this is because the newly inaugurated Prime Minister gets to decide when the first meeting of the House of Commons will be. Often it's not for several months until after he's sworn in, as you can see from the chart. So already we can see that the Prime Minister holds authority independent from and indeed over the Parliament. Don't get me wrong, the Parliament has a lot of important powers, chiefly the power to pass laws and authorize a budget for government spending. But the Prime Minister also has plenty of powers that don't involve any parliamentary involvement at all. Prime Minister Carney, for instance, has been running around doing all sorts of things. And as I said, the Parliament has yet to sit even once during his prime ministership. And this is because, ironically enough, parliaments of the past have given a lot of powers to the Prime Minister. I mean, this isn't some nefarious thing. Laws are meaningless unless someone is given the authority to implement them. This is the whole idea behind needing an executive branch to enforce laws independent of a legislative branch to write them. So really, most laws, whether that's outlawing terrorism or legalizing marijuana, wind up giving new powers to the Prime Minister and his cabinet to see that these things actually get done and aren't just words on a page. But we don't need laws or budgets to be written all of the time, so a Prime Minister can easily go a long while before finding it necessary to convene the Parliament. You can see that Prime Minister Clark over here waited a full 4 months after he was sworn in before convening the first meeting of the House of Commons of his administration. But in theory, a Prime Minister can stretch things out even longer, as the Canadian Constitution says that the Parliament only has to meet at least once a year. Now, in Clark's case, we can say that there was a slightly cynical motive at play. And this is because the House of Commons has the right to pass a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister at any time, which then forces him to hold an emergency election. Prime Minister Clark only won a narrow minority government in the election of 1979, and all of the other parties, who collectively formed a majority, were pretty hostile to him, so he had an obvious incentive to delay their ability to vote no confidence in his administration. So anyway, just to refresh, let us now walk through the timeline of one of Canada's more recent prime ministers, Stephen Harper. On January 23rd, 2006, Canada held a general election pitting incumbent Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin against Stephen Harper, the head of the Conservative Party. As the votes were counted that night and the network started to tally the seats, the Conservatives gradually eclipsed the Liberals. It became clear that they were going to win the most seats, but due to a strong showing by the other parties, they wouldn't win an outright majority. In other words, it was a minority government. At about 10:30 p.m., Prime Minister Martin called Harper to concede defeat and then announced it to the nation.
I've just telephoned Stephen Harper and I've offered him my congratulations. The people of Canada have chosen him to lead a minority government. I wish him the best.
3 days later, Prime Minister designate Harper met with Governor General Michael Jean and announced that his inauguration would take place on February the 6th. And then, 11 days after that, Prime Minister Martin formally resigned, and Stephen Harper took the oath of office and became the 22nd Prime Minister of Canada. 2 months after that, on April 3rd, 2006, the newly elected House of Commons was convened by Prime Minister Harper for the first time. Now, the first convening of a new parliament after an election features a lot of razzle-dazzle, the highlight of which is the Governor-General's throne speech. This is when she reads a special speech written by the Prime Minister's team, outlining his government's agenda for the next year or so. And following that, usually the next day, the Prime Minister stands in the House of Commons and makes a motion to adopt the speech, and the House usually votes to accept it, often unanimously or even by a voice vote, as was the case with Harper's 2006 throne speech. In theory, this is the first opportunity that the opposition parties have to vote no confidence, since, according to parliamentary procedure, they could propose an amendment to the Prime Minister's motion and turn it into a non-confidence vote. But as far as I know, this has never actually happened. Even poor old Prime Minister Clark got a good 2 months of cooperation from the Parliament before it voted him down. As I said, the Canadian Constitution says that the Parliament has to meet at least once a year, and it specifically has to meet at some point to authorize funding for the government. But beyond that, the Parliament serves at the discretion of the Prime Minister, who controls the timings of its sittings and its recesses and its prorogations, which is the term for a sort of hard reset of parliamentary business, requiring everything to start over with a new throne speech. The Constitution says that there has to be a parliamentary election every 5 years, and Canadian law requires elections to be held on every 4th October. Although, since the Prime Minister holds ultimate authority over the Parliament, he can choose to hold an election earlier if he so decides, which is what Prime Minister Carney did last month. Even an emergency election held in the aftermath of a no-confidence vote is technically a decision that the Prime Minister makes as well. There have even been times in the past where a Prime Minister has ignored a no-confidence vote. All right, now let us talk about prime ministerial succession. When a Prime Minister announces his plan to resign, as Prime Minister Trudeau did back in January, it falls to his party to pick a successor, which sounds simple, but it can be kind of weird in practice. What even is a party, after all? In Canada, a political party is basically a corporation. It is a private entity that operates outside of government and can be set up in any way it wants. A party can accordingly pick whoever it wants to be its leader, and pick that leader through whatever process it chooses. Mark Carney was picked to be Prime Minister by the votes of 150,000 registered Liberal Party members, ordinary Canadian citizens. In fact, I think some of them weren't even citizens. As I mentioned earlier, Carney isn't a member of the Parliament, and clearly neither were the overwhelming majority of party members who voted him in. So on what basis can we say that he is Canada's democratically legitimate leader? Well, I guess the logic of the Canadian system would hold that since Justin Trudeau was democratically elected Prime Minister as head of the party with the most seats in the House, Trudeau can transfer his democratic legitimacy to the corporate entity that runs his political party and let it make certain decisions independently of him. Although it's actually even weirder and more confusing than that, because technically speaking, when the outgoing Prime Minister meets with the Governor-General to arrange a transfer of power in these sorts of situations, it is the outgoing Prime Minister who officially designates his successor. So then it's like, okay, so is his political party just giving him a suggestion? Either way, there doesn't seem to be any sort of limiting principle on who can be designated as a replacement Prime Minister. A non-member of Parliament, a child, the President of Madagascar, who can say? Which brings us to one of the big underlying themes of all of this, which is the enormous role played by precedent and convention in determining how the Canadian prime ministerial system actually works. As I explained in my Canadian political system iceberg video, Canada's constitution is not very well written and contains all sorts of conspicuous gaps that fail to describe important aspects of the Canadian government. Important aspects like, say, the prime ministership. You can search the text of the Canadian Constitution and all of the other documents that have the status of constitutional law in Canada, and you will only ever see the prime ministership occasionally mentioned in a very passive way, if at all. In the 70s and 80s, there was some effort to amend the Constitution in a way that would finally put on paper the exact process through which the Prime Minister is chosen, but nothing came of this, and in my opinion, the country is worse for it, because this means that our whole system of deciding who gets to run the country is ultimately just governed by traditions that everyone politely agrees to follow. And that means there is always a looming danger that someday someone will choose to break one of these traditions and thereby plunge Canada into a full-blown constitutional crisis. The biggest crisis will probably come the day that an incumbent Prime Minister refuses to surrender power to a minority government of the opposite party. The very concept of minority governments has always struck some Canadians as kind of democratically dubious, since it places such a high value on winning the most seats in the House, independent of the combined preference of the House as a whole. In some other countries, the Prime Minister is the head of a parliamentary coalition, which is an alliance of multiple ideologically aligned parties that jointly form a parliamentary majority. In these sorts of places, prime ministers don't come to power right after an election like they do in Canada. Instead, elections are merely considered the starting point for lengthy negotiations between the parties over who should be prime minister and what his agenda should be. In Holland, for example, 7 months elapsed between their most recent parliamentary election and the inauguration of their current prime minister, who wasn't even a guy who had run in their election at all. Some Canadians want coalition-style governments to come to this country. You definitely hear from some people, especially supporters of some of the smaller parties, who don't like the idea of parliamentary elections operating as prime ministerial elections, and would prefer to see who gets the prime ministership decided through negotiation among the parties after an election, Dutch style. But it's hard to know exactly how this would work in Canada, just given how entrenched our tradition of quickly inaugurating a prime minister right after an election is. The more radical proposal that you sometimes hear is this idea that an incumbent prime minister who loses an election to a minority government should just refuse to leave office. This is based on the premise that since prime ministers do not have term limits in Canada, there is nothing in law that says that a prime minister has to leave office on any particular day. And indeed, an incumbent prime minister always has to go through the motions of formally resigning on the same day that a new prime minister is sworn in. So if we imagine a scenario where a prime minister looks at the results on election night and is like, I could work with this. Maybe he could just refuse to concede defeat and refuse to resign. He could come up with some way to appease the other parties into not non-confidence voting him whenever he decided to reconvene the parliament, possibly only after months and months of negotiation. Of course, this theory invites a lot of difficult questions. The big one is just that if we accept the principle that a prime minister doesn't have to concede defeat to a minority government, then there's nothing stopping him from refusing to concede defeat to a majority government either. If a prime minister only ever has to leave office on his own terms, then any prime minister who loses any election, no matter how big the landslide, could justify staying in office up to a year after the fact, continuing to run the country until he hits that constitutional deadline of having to reconvene the new House of Commons, at which point the majority would vote no confidence in his throne speech and force a new election, although maybe he would just ignore that too. The other challenge is that all of this would really put the Governor General in a difficult spot. The Governor General organizes the transfer of power between prime ministers, and her office operates on the assumption that the head of the largest party following an election gets sworn in as prime minister a few days later. If a prime minister refused to leave office on the basis that he had some coalition plan cooking, does the Governor General have an obligation to go along with this? Or should she uphold standard practice? The answer involves the degree that you believe the Governor General possesses any individual agency to make independent decisions. In normal circumstances, the Governor General is a figurehead who grants ceremonial approval to everything the Prime Minister wants. But if the Prime Minister wants something that's really weird, does she have an obligation to give approval to those decisions too? Some people say that she could evoke the emergency authority of the Crown to fire the Prime Minister, or force the new parliament to immediately convene so it could vote no confidence in him. But that would be a radical break from tradition as well. These are all questions that have never really been adjudicated through the Canadian political process before. The last time a prime minister refused to concede and leave office after an election was literally 100 years ago in 1925, a time when Canada was not yet a fully independent country, and Canada's political culture was much more immature. And in the years since then, precedents around the prime ministership have grown more and more entrenched in terms of who gets the job and how. But like I said, we are still ultimately operating on the basis of customs, and customs are only respected until they're not. Partisanship, ideology, and the jealous pursuit of power for its own sake often emerge as the enemies of democratic tradition, and it does seem like it could just be a matter of time before these forces upend Canada's status quo. So let me end this video with a very specific question. As I mentioned at the start, the concept of a parliamentary system is an incredibly vague one and tends to assume all countries where the political leader holds a job that we translate to prime minister in English comes to power in a broadly similar way. But I'm sure to a lot of my viewers in other parliamentary countries, the Canadian system that I've described today doesn't sound that much like what you guys do. So I'm curious, tell me how the prime minister in your country is chosen. Are there identifiable prime ministerial candidates? Is the prime minister directly elected by the parliament or indirectly elected by the voters? Do you ever have minority governments or always coalitions? And how soon after an election does a prime minister take office? Is there any aspect of the Canadian system that you think is better than what you do? And in what ways do you think our way is worse? Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, do not forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.